Sometimes a man's darkest moment becomes the doorway to his greatest triumph. When you've lost everything and everyone has given up on you, that's when life reveals its most extraordinary surprises. Tom Reyes was 53 years old when he spent his last dollar on what everyone called a worthless piece of junk. The Cold War submarine sat rotting in San Pedro Harbor, and his neighbors laughed at his foolishness. His ex-wife called him crazy. Even his own daughter stopped returning his calls. But Tom had always been good with his hands, and he knew how to find value where others saw only failure. As he explored the submarine's flooded corridors, he discovered hidden chambers that weren't on any official blueprint. Behind welded steel plates, he found something that changed everything. A secret worth nearly $200 million that powerful people had killed to protect. What happens when a desperate man finds a treasure that was never meant to be discovered? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning fog hung low over San Pedro Harbor like a grey wool blanket, muffling the sounds of creaking dock lines and distant foghorns. Tom Reyes stood at the edge of Pier 17, his weathered hands wrapped around a chipped ceramic mug filled with coffee that had gone cold an hour ago. The steam had long since stopped rising, much like his hopes for finding steady work again. At 53, Tom carried the kind of exhaustion that sleep couldn't cure. It lived in his shoulders, rounded from decades of hunching over engine blocks and transmission cases. It showed in his eyes, brown as old leather and just as creased at the corners. His father's toolbox sat at his feet, the red metal faded to rust orange after 30 years of faithful service. Inside that box lay the sum total of Tom's professional identity, precision instruments that had once made him indispensable at Rodriguez Marine Repair. That was before the shop closed, before the bank foreclosed on his house, before Linda filed the divorce papers and took half of what little remained. "You're early again, Tom." The voice belonged to Pete Castellanos, the harbor master who'd become something between a friend and a keeper over the past few months. Pete emerged from the marina office, his own coffee steaming in the cool morning air. "Auction doesn't start for another 2 hours." Tom nodded toward the cluster of surplus military vessels moored at the far end of the harbor. Destroyers, patrol boats, and supply ships in various stages of decay waited like forgotten veterans at a reunion nobody wanted to attend. Among them, almost hidden between a rusted Coast Guard cutter and a decommissioned minesweeper, sat the object of Tom's desperate attention, a Balao-class submarine from the Second World War. "Wanted to get another look at her before the serious bidders show up," Tom said, his voice carrying the rasp of a man who'd breathed too much engine exhaust over the years. "Make sure I'm not making the biggest mistake of my life." Pete followed his gaze to the submarine. The vessel's hull, painted in faded navy gray, bore the scars of decades above water. Rust streaked down her sides like tears, and barnacles clung to her waterline like unwanted memories. Her conning tower stood crooked, damaged in some long-forgotten incident, giving the entire boat a slightly drunken appearance. "Hell, Tom, you already made that mistake when you decided to bid on that floating coffin. What's Linda think about you spending your last dime on Uncle Sam's leftovers?" The mention of his ex-wife sent a familiar ache through Tom's chest. Linda hadn't spoken to him in 3 weeks. Not since their daughter Sarah's birthday dinner had ended with another argument about his unrealistic schemes and refusal to accept reality. The reality, according to Linda, was that men their age didn't get second chances. They got part-time jobs at hardware stores and social security checks that didn't cover the rent. "Linda thinks I've lost my mind," Tom said, taking a sip of the cold coffee and grimacing. "Maybe she's right, but this old girl's got good bones underneath all that rust. I can feel it." Pete studied the submarine with the practiced eye of someone who'd seen enough vessels come and go through these waters. "You know they tried to sell her 3 times already? Nobody wants the maintenance headache." She's been sitting here for 2 years, taking up space and costing the government money, just to keep her afloat. That was exactly why Tom had hope. In his experience, the best opportunities came disguised as other people's problems. The submarine represented everything he understood about the intersection of mechanical systems and human neglect. Give him 6 months, the right tools, and enough determination, and he could make anything run again. The sound of car doors slamming echoed across the harbor as the early arrivals began gathering near the auction staging area. Tom recognized some of the faces: scrap metal dealers, maritime salvage companies, and the occasional eccentric collector with more money than sense. They moved with the confidence of people who'd done this before, people who could afford to lose a few $1,000s on a whim. Tom's phone buzzed in his pocket. Sarah's name appeared on the cracked screen, and for a moment his heart lifted. At 28, she'd inherited his stubborn streak and her mother's sharp intelligence, along with an engineering degree that made her the family success story. Their relationship had been strained since the divorce, but she still called occasionally, usually when Linda had been particularly harsh about his prospects. "Dad, Mom told me about the auction thing. Please tell me you're not actually going through with this." Tom walked away from Pete, seeking privacy for what he knew would be another difficult conversation. "Morning to you too, sweetheart. How's the job going?" "Don't change the subject. Are you really about to spend your last $10,000 on a submarine?" "A submarine, Dad. Not a boat, not a yacht, not even a decent fishing vessel. A military submarine that's probably full of asbestos and oil leaks." "Your old man knows a thing or two about fixing oil leaks. This isn't funny. What happens when you run out of money trying to fix this thing? What happens when you can't afford to dock it anywhere? You'll be homeless and boatless." The concern in her voice reminded Tom of the little girl who used to sit on his workbench, handing him tools and asking endless questions about how engines worked. She'd been his shadow in those days, back when Linda still believed in his ability to provide for the family. "Sarah, I've been fixing things my whole life. Engines that wouldn't start, transmissions that wouldn't shift, electrical systems that made no sense to anyone else. This is just bigger. It's a submarine, not a Chevy pickup. And even if you could fix it, then what? Turn it into some kind of tourist attraction? Sell submarine rides to kids?" Tom had wondered the same thing during the sleepless nights leading up to the auction. The practical applications for a restored submarine were limited, especially for a man with no business experience and dwindling resources. But something about the vessel called to him, a feeling he couldn't explain to Sarah or Linda or even himself. "I'll figure it out," he said, knowing how hollow the word sounded. "I always do. Dad, please, just come work with me for a while. The construction company is always looking for good mechanics. It's steady money, health insurance, a future that makes sense." The offer was generous, and Tom knew it came from love. But the thought of working for his daughter, of becoming the old man who needed family charity to survive, felt worse than financial ruin. "I appreciate that, sweetheart, more than you know, but I need to try this first." The silence on the other end stretched long enough for Tom to wonder if the call had dropped. When Sarah spoke again, her voice carried a mixture of frustration and resignation that reminded him painfully of her mother. "Okay, Dad. But when this goes wrong, and it will go wrong, promise me you'll call. Promise me you won't try to handle everything alone." After ending the call, Tom returned to Pete's side. The harbor master was watching a group of men in expensive suits examine the destroyer's superstructure, their conversation conducted in the loud, confident tones of people accustomed to getting what they wanted. "Family advice?" Pete asked. "The kind I probably should take but won't." "Yeah. I know that feeling. My ex-wife spent 20 years telling me to quit the Coast Guard and get a real job. Now I'm harbor master. She's married to an accountant in Phoenix, and I'm the one who gets to watch sunrises over the Pacific every morning." The comparison wasn't lost on Tom. Pete had made his choice to stay connected to the water, even if it meant smaller paychecks and less conventional success. There was something to be said for following your instincts, even when everyone else thought you were making a mistake. An hour later, the auction began in earnest. Tom positioned himself near the back of the crowd, close enough to hear the auctioneer, but far enough away to avoid drawing attention. His father's toolbox sat between his feet like an anchor, a reminder of the legacy he was trying to preserve. The first several lots went quickly, small patrol boats and equipment lots that attracted predictable buyers. Tom watched the bidding patterns, noting which dealers were serious and which were just testing the waters. When the submarine's lot number was finally called, he felt his heart rate increase. The auctioneer, a thin man in a government-issued windbreaker, began his pitch with obvious reluctance. Lot 47, Palau-class submarine, commissioned 1943, decommissioned 1971. Vessel requires significant restoration work and is sold as is, where is, with no warranties or guarantees. The opening bid was set at $5,000. For several long moments, nobody raised their hand. Tom could see other bidders examining their catalogues, doing mental calculations about salvage value versus restoration costs. The submarine's reputation as a maintenance nightmare was well established among the regular auction crowd. "Do I hear 5,000? The auctioneer repeated, his tone suggesting he expected to move on quickly. Tom raised his hand. A murmur ran through the crowd as heads turned to identify the bidder. Tom felt exposed, like a man standing naked in front of people who knew better than to waste money on impossible dreams. 5,000 to the gentleman in the back. Do I hear 6? Silence. Tom allowed himself to hope that maybe, just maybe, his instincts were right and everyone else was wrong. Going once at 5,000. 7,000. The voice came from near the front of the crowd. Tom craned his neck and saw a woman in a tailored business suit, her hand raised with casual confidence. She looked like someone accustomed to getting what she wanted through superior financial resources. Tom's stomach dropped. 7,000 represented most of his remaining savings, money he'd planned to use for initial repairs and equipment. But walking away now meant accepting defeat before the real work had even begun. 8,000, he called out, his voice carrying farther than he'd intended. The woman turned to look at him, her expression evaluating. She had the sharp features of someone who made quick decisions and rarely second-guessed herself. After a moment that felt like an hour, she shook her head almost imperceptibly. 8,000, going once, going twice, sold to the gentleman in the back. The gavel fell with a sound like a gunshot. Tom had just purchased a World War II submarine with money he couldn't afford to lose. Around him, the crowd was already moving toward the next lot, their attention shifting to more practical investments. Pete appeared at his elbow, clapping him on the shoulder with the kind of hearty congratulations reserved for men who'd just made spectacular mistakes. "Well, Tom, you're officially a submarine owner. What's the first thing you're going to do with her?" Tom looked across the harbor at his new acquisition, sitting low in the water like a sleeping whale. The afternoon sun had broken through the fog, casting the rusted hull in golden light that almost made her look majestic. For the first time in months, he felt something that might have been optimism. "I'm going to go aboard and see what she's been hiding all these years." The submarine's deck felt solid beneath Tom's boots, more stable than he'd expected from a vessel that had been floating abandoned for 2 years. The afternoon sun cast sharp shadows across the curved hull, and the smell of salt air mixed with the metallic tang of old steel. Pete had arranged for harbor security to escort Tom aboard, though the guard seemed more interested in his phone than ensuring safety protocols. Tom's father's toolbox sat on the deck beside the main hatch, its familiar weight a comfort in unfamiliar territory. He'd brought basic tools for his initial inspection: flashlights, measuring tape, a camera to document what he found. The submarine's conning tower loomed above him, its periscope housing tilted at an odd angle that suggested either damage or deliberate modification. The main hatch, painted navy gray like everything else, opened with surprising ease. Tom had expected rust, seized mechanisms, the usual problems that plagued abandoned vessels. Instead, the heavy steel wheel turned smoothly, as if someone had maintained it recently. The observation struck him as odd, but not alarming. Government surplus equipment sometimes received basic maintenance to prevent total deterioration. Descending into the submarine felt like entering a different world. The cramped interior still held the ghost scents of diesel fuel, machine oil, and something Tom couldn't identify, a metallic sweetness that reminded him of old blood. His flashlight beam revealed a surprisingly clean interior, though water damage was evident in the lower compartments. The forward torpedo room stretched ahead of him, its tube doors sealed and secured. Bunks lined the walls, stacked 3 high in the efficient manner of military vessels. Tom ran his hands along the bulkheads, feeling for structural damage or unusual modifications. His mechanical instincts told him the submarine's bones were sound, despite her weathered appearance. Moving aft through the boat, Tom consulted the blueprint he'd downloaded from the government auction site. The layout showed standard compartments, crew quarters, galley, engine room, battery compartments. Everything appeared normal until he reached the section between the control room and the engine compartment. According to the blueprint, this area should house the submarine's electrical distribution panels and auxiliary equipment. What Tom found instead was a solid steel wall with no visible access points. The welding work was professional, but clearly not original construction. Someone had sealed off an entire section of the vessel. Tom studied the steel barrier more carefully. The welding beads were uniform, suggesting machine work rather than field repairs. More importantly, the steel itself was newer than the surrounding hull plates. This modification had been done years after the submarine's original construction, possibly during her final years of service. His flashlight revealed something else unusual, a series of small holes drilled near the base of the welded wall, each about the diameter of a pencil. They appeared to be ventilation holes, which made no sense if the space behind the wall was simply sealed off permanently. Whatever lay beyond that steel barrier was meant to remain accessible to air circulation. Tom took photographs of the welded wall from multiple angles, documenting the unusual construction. His mechanical mind was already working on the problem of how to access the sealed compartment without damaging whatever might be inside. The welding looked professional enough that removing it would require careful planning and the right equipment. The engine room told a different story. The submarine's diesel engines were in remarkably good condition, showing signs of recent maintenance that contradicted her abandoned status. Someone had been keeping the mechanical systems operational, which raised questions about why the vessel had been declared surplus in the first place. Tom found the submarine's maintenance logs tucked inside a waterproof container in the engine room. The entries were routine until 1971, when they abruptly stopped. No decommissioning paperwork, no final inspections, no transfer documents. The submarine had simply vanished from official record-keeping in the middle of what appeared to be active service. More disturbing were the personal items scattered throughout the crew quarters. Coffee cups sat on tables as if their owners had just stepped away. Photographs of families remained pinned to bulkheads, their edges curled with age but still recognizable. The submarine felt less like a decommissioned vessel and more like a place people had left in a hurry. Tom's exploration was interrupted by voices from the deck above. Through the open hatch, he could hear Pete talking to someone with a crisp, authoritative tone. Government official, Tom guessed. Probably someone from the surplus office checking on the new owner. "Mr. Reyes? Are you down there?" Pete's voice echoed through the submarine's interior. Tom climbed back to the conning tower, emerging into afternoon sunlight that seemed blindingly bright after the submarine's dim interior. Pete stood on the deck with a man in a dark suit who looked like he'd stepped out of a federal employee handbook, conservative tie, polished shoes, expression that revealed nothing. "Tom, this is Agent Marcus Webb from the Defense Department. He wanted to meet the submarine's new owner." Webb extended his hand with the firm grip of someone accustomed to making first impressions count. His eyes were pale blue, the kind that seemed to catalogue everything they saw. Tom estimated him to be in his early 40s, old enough to have authority, but young enough to suggest he wasn't close to retirement. "Congratulations on your purchase, Mr. Reyes. I hope you're finding everything in order." "Mostly," Tom said, studying the agent's face for clues about his real purpose, "though I notice some modifications that aren't reflected in the official blueprints." Webb's expression didn't change, but something shifted in his posture. Military vessels often undergo classified modifications during their service lives. The blueprints provided to civilian buyers show only the basic layout for safety purposes. And the sealed compartments? Safety precaution. Some areas of the vessel contained hazardous materials that required permanent isolation. Nothing that should concern a civilian owner, as long as you don't attempt to access those areas. The warning was politely delivered but unmistakably clear. Webb was telling him to stay away from whatever lay behind that welded wall, which only made Tom more curious about what someone was so determined to hide. "I appreciate the guidance," Tom said, keeping his own expression neutral. "I'm planning some restoration work, so I'll make sure to respect any safety restrictions." Webb handed him a business card with only a name and phone number printed on expensive paper. "If you encounter anything unusual during your restoration, please don't hesitate to contact me. The government maintains an interest in ensuring proper handling of former military assets." After Webb and Pete left, Tom remained on deck as the sun began its descent toward the horizon. The harbor grew quieter as the day shift workers headed home to families and dinners and lives that made sense. Tom felt the familiar isolation that had become his constant companion since the divorce. But something had changed during his exploration of the submarine. For the first time in months, he felt like he had a purpose that extended beyond simple survival. The vessel held secrets, and Tom had always been good at solving mechanical puzzles. The sealed compartment represented a problem that needed solving, regardless of what some government agent preferred. Tom opened his father's toolbox and selected a small mirror on a telescoping handle, the kind mechanics used to inspect hard-to-reach spaces. Back inside the submarine, he positioned the mirror near one of the ventilation holes in the welded wall and angled his flashlight to illuminate whatever lay beyond. The reflection showed him a glimpse of another compartment, larger than he'd expected and clearly not empty. Metal containers lined the far wall, each about the size of a footlocker. More interesting were the documents scattered on what appeared to be a small table, papers and folders that suggested someone had been working in that space. Tom photographed what he could see through the mirror, though the images were blurry and incomplete. Whatever lay behind that wall was important enough for Agent Webb to make a personal visit on Tom's first day aboard. Important enough for someone to seal the compartment with professional-grade welding. As darkness settled over San Pedro Harbor, Tom secured the submarine and gathered his tools. Tomorrow, he would begin the real work of restoration. But tonight, he had research to do. Someone had gone to considerable trouble to hide whatever was in that sealed compartment, and Tom intended to discover why. The submarine's secrets were about to collide with a desperate man's determination to rebuild his life. Tom arrived at the submarine before dawn, his breath visible in the cool morning air. Sleep had been elusive, his mind churning through possibilities about the sealed compartment and Agent Webb's warning. He'd spent hours researching Balao-class submarines online, learning about their construction, their service records, and their eventual fates. What he'd discovered raised more questions than answers. The submarine, designated as USS Grouper, had been commissioned in 1943 and served with distinction in the Pacific Theater. According to official records, she'd been decommissioned in 1971 and transferred to government surplus. But Tom had found references to a submarine matching her specifications being involved in classified operations as late as 1975, 4 years after her supposed retirement from service. His father's toolbox felt heavier this morning, loaded with additional equipment he'd gathered the night before: a small acetylene torch, metal cutting discs, pry bars, and a portable work light. If he was going to access that sealed compartment, he needed to be prepared for serious metalwork. The submarine's interior was quieter in the early morning, free from the harbor's daytime bustle. Tom made his way directly to the welded wall, examining it more carefully in the better light provided by his work lamp. The steel barrier was thicker than he'd initially realized, suggesting whoever had sealed it wanted to ensure it stayed closed. Using a small dental mirror, another tool inherited from his father's collection of problem-solving implements, Tom explored the ventilation holes more systematically. The hidden compartment was larger than his previous glimpse had suggested, extending further aft than the blueprint indicated. More importantly, he could see evidence of electrical connections running into the space, suggesting it had remained powered long after the submarine's official decommissioning. Tom began his work carefully, using a small grinding wheel to remove a section of welding near one of the ventilation holes. The metal was harder than expected, and progress was slow. But gradually, he managed to enlarge one of the holes enough to insert his flashlight and get a better view of the interior. What he saw made him stop grinding immediately. The hidden compartment contained a small workshop area, complete with workbenches, tool racks, and what appeared to be document filing systems. But more intriguingly, scattered across the work surfaces were personal items that seemed frozen in time. A coffee cup with dried residue, reading glasses folded on an open notebook, a photograph of a woman and child propped against a tool rack. Tom photographed everything he could see through the enlarged hole, his camera flash illuminating details that raised disturbing questions. The workshop looked like someone had been working there recently, not decades ago. Fresh tool marks scarred the workbench surfaces. Papers scattered on the tables appeared clean and unworn by time. One document visible in his photographs made Tom's blood run cold. It was a personnel file with a photograph attached, showing a Navy officer in dress uniform. The man appeared to be in his 40s, with the weathered features of someone who'd spent years at sea. But what shocked Tom was the resemblance between the officer and Agent Webb. The facial structure was remarkably similar, the same pale eyes, the same angular jawline. Tom spent the morning carefully documenting everything visible through the hole, taking dozens of photographs from different angles. The evidence suggested the sealed compartment had been in use far more recently than the submarine's official decommissioning date. Someone had been using this vessel as a base of operations for purposes that weren't reflected in any government records. Around midday, his work was interrupted by footsteps on the deck above. Tom quickly stowed his tools and climbed to the conning tower, expecting to find Pete or perhaps another government official. Instead, he encountered a woman in her 30s with short dark hair and intelligent eyes that seemed to catalogue everything they saw. "Mr. Reyes, I'm Dr. Elena Vasquez from the Maritime Historical Society. I understand you've purchased the grouper." Tom wiped grease from his hands before shaking hers. "That's right, though I'm beginning to think she's more complicated than I initially realized. Most submarines are. They tend to accumulate stories during their service lives, not all of which make it into the official records. I'm researching vessels that participated in classified operations during the Cold War. The grouper appears on several lists that suggest she had a more interesting career than her public service record indicates." Dr. Vasquez's presence felt like a lifeline to Tom. Here was someone with legitimate academic credentials who might help him understand what he'd discovered. More importantly, she didn't seem to be warning him away from his investigations. "What kind of classified operations?" Tom asked. "Intelligence gathering, mostly. During the height of the Cold War, submarines like the grouper were used for missions that required extended periods underwater in foreign waters. They'd intercept communications, photograph coastal installations, sometimes retrieve or deliver materials that couldn't be transported through normal diplomatic channels. And after the war ended?" Dr. Vasquez hesitated, choosing her words carefully. Some submarines continued operating in unofficial capacities. The intelligence networks established during wartime don't simply disappear when treaties are signed. There are indications that certain vessels remained active in classified roles long after their official decommissioning dates. Tom led her below decks, showing her through the submarine's main compartments while carefully avoiding any mention of the sealed area. Dr. Vasquez examined everything with the thorough attention of someone who understood maritime history. Her observations about the submarine's modifications and maintenance level confirmed Tom's suspicions about the vessel's continued use after 1971. The electrical systems show signs of upgrading that post-date the submarine's supposed retirement, she noted, examining junction boxes in the control room. Someone invested considerable money in keeping this vessel operational. Any idea who? That's the mystery, isn't it? Official records show the grouper being transferred to surplus in 1971, but evidence suggests she remained active for several more years. Someone with significant resources and authorization was using this submarine for purposes that weren't documented in normal Navy files. Dr. Vasquez left him her contact information and promised to share any additional research she uncovered about the grouper's classified service record. Her visit had provided Tom with valuable context, but it had also heightened his sense that he was dealing with something far more complex than a simple surplus purchase. That evening, alone aboard the submarine, Tom returned to his careful work on the welded wall. The enlarged hole now provided a clear view into the hidden compartment, and what he saw convinced him that his discovery represented something potentially dangerous. Among the papers scattered on the workshop table, he could make out what appeared to be navigation charts, personnel files, and documents bearing official government seals. More disturbing were the metal containers lining the far wall, each secured with heavy-duty locks that suggested their contents were valuable or dangerous. Tom found himself thinking about Agent Webb's warning and Dr. Vasquez's research into classified submarine operations. The evidence suggested the grouper had been involved in activities that extended far beyond normal military service. The sealed compartment represented an archive of those activities, preserved like a time capsule from the Cold War era. But if the submarine's classified service had ended decades ago, why had Agent Webb seemed so concerned about Tom's restoration plans? And why did the hidden workshop area appear to have been used so recently? Tom carefully concealed his work on the welded wall before leaving the submarine that night. Tomorrow, he would need to make a decision about how far to pursue his investigation. The smart choice would be to follow Agent Webb's advice and focus on restoring the submarine's public areas while leaving the secrets alone. But Tom had never been particularly good at making smart choices, and the corroded naval ID badge he'd found, wedged behind a pipe in the hidden compartment, bearing the name Lieutenant Commander James Webb, suggested that Agent Webb's interest in the submarine might be more personal than official. Tom spent the weekend researching Lieutenant Commander James Webb, using every online resource he could access from the harbor's Wi-Fi connection. The search results were frustratingly sparse service records that ended abruptly in 1975, a few mentions in naval history forums, and one newspaper obituary from 1976 that raised more questions than it answered. According to the obituary, James Webb had died in a training accident at sea, survived by a wife and young son. The timing aligned perfectly with Tom's theory about Agent Marcus Webb's connection to the submarine. If Marcus was James's son, that would explain his personal interest in ensuring the grouper's secrets remained buried. The encrypted radio logs Tom discovered Monday morning provided the breakthrough he'd been seeking. Hidden inside a waterproof container in the submarine's communication center, the logs contained coded transmissions dating from 1973 to 1975. Tom couldn't decode the messages themselves, but the transmission dates and frequency patterns told a story of regular contact with shore-based handlers during a period when the submarine was supposedly decommissioned. More revealing were the personal notes written in the margins of the log sheets. Someone, probably Lieutenant Commander Webb, had been tracking cargo transfers, personnel movements, and what appeared to be payment schedules. The notes referenced Project Seahawk and mentioned coordinates off the California coast where the submarine had conducted regular operations. Tom photographed every page of the radio logs, building a comprehensive record of the submarine's classified activities. The evidence painted a picture of an intelligence operation that had continued for years after the official end of the Cold War, using the submarine as a mobile base for missions that weren't reflected in any public records. The personal side of the story emerged from items Tom found scattered throughout the hidden compartment. Lieutenant Commander Webb had been a methodical record keeper, maintaining detailed journals that chronicled both official operations and personal reflections. The entries revealed a man increasingly troubled by the nature of his assignments and concerned about the legal implications of his activities. One journal entry, dated March 1975, was particularly illuminating. The cargo transfers are becoming more frequent, and the questions from Washington more pointed. I'm beginning to suspect that Project Seahawk serves interests that extend beyond national security. The materials we're moving don't match the intelligence profiles we were briefed on. Someone is using Navy resources for personal gain. Tom found additional evidence of Webb's growing concerns in letters he'd drafted, but apparently never sent. The letters were addressed to various Navy officials and congressional representatives, describing illegal activities involving the submarine and requesting formal investigations. The letters had been carefully preserved, suggesting Webb had intended them as insurance against retaliation. The most disturbing discovery was a series of photographs showing the submarine loading cargo at night from unmarked vessels. The images were grainy and taken from concealed positions, but they clearly showed metal containers being transferred aboard the grouper under circumstances that suggested secrecy was paramount. Tom recognized some of the containers as matching those still locked in the submarine's hidden compartment. As Tom studied the photographs, he became aware of voices on the deck above. He quickly stowed his findings and climbed to investigate, expecting another visit from Pete or perhaps Dr. Vasquez. Instead, he found two men in dark suits, examining the submarine's exterior with the practiced attention of people conducting surveillance. "Can I help you, gentlemen?" Tom called out, though something about their manner suggested they weren't casual visitors. The older of the two men looked up with pale eyes that seemed familiar, though Tom was certain they'd never met. "Mr. Reyes, I'm Agent Collins from the Treasury Department. This is Agent Martinez. We're investigating irregularities in the government surplus program." Tom climbed fully onto the deck, noting that both agents maintained positions that would allow them to quickly block his access to the submarine's hatch. Their body language suggested they were prepared for potential confrontation. "What kind of irregularities?" "Vessels sold through surplus auctions are sometimes found to contain materials that should have been removed before transfer to civilian ownership," Collins explained. "We're conducting routine inspections to ensure compliance with federal regulations." "I haven't found anything unusual," Tom lied, maintaining what he hoped was convincing eye contact. "Just the typical debris you'd expect from a vessel that's been abandoned for years." Agent Martinez stepped forward, his expression skeptical. "Mr. Reyes, we have reason to believe this particular submarine may contain classified materials that pose national security risks. We're prepared to offer you fair compensation for your purchase price if you're willing to transfer ownership back to the government." The offer confirmed Tom's suspicions about the importance of his discoveries. The government wasn't conducting routine inspections. They were specifically trying to reclaim the submarine before its secrets could be exposed. "I appreciate the offer," Tom said carefully, but I'm planning to restore her as a historical exhibit. The community is excited about having a piece of naval history in the harbor. Collins and Martinez exchanged glances that suggested they'd anticipated his refusal. Mr. Reyes, I strongly encourage you to reconsider. Some discoveries are better left undisturbed, especially when they involve matters of national security. After the agents left, Tom remained on deck for a long time, watching their sedan disappear into harbor traffic. Their visit had been polite, but unmistakably threatening. Someone powerful wanted the submarine's secrets to remain hidden, and they were prepared to use official pressure to ensure Tom's cooperation. That evening, Tom called Dr. Vasquez and arranged to meet her at a restaurant away from the harbor. He needed advice from someone who understood the historical and legal implications of his discoveries, and he was beginning to suspect that his phone conversations might not be private. Dr. Vasquez listened to his account of the hidden compartment and the government agent's visit with the careful attention of someone accustomed to evaluating evidence. Her expression grew increasingly concerned as Tom described the radio logs and Lieutenant Commander Webb's journals. "You're dealing with something that could have significant historical importance," she said finally. "But you're also potentially exposing activities that powerful people want to keep buried. The question is whether you're prepared for the consequences of continuing your investigation." "What kind of consequences?" "Legal challenges, certainly. Possibly criminal charges if they can argue you're interfering with national security. And based on what you've told me about the cargo transfers and financial irregularities, there might be people with personal interests in ensuring this information never becomes public." Tom thought about his conversation with Agent Webb and the resemblance between the agent and the submarine's former commander. What if someone with official authority is personally involved in the cover-up? Dr. Vasquez studied his face carefully. "Then you need to be very careful about who you trust, and you need to document everything in ways that can't be suppressed or destroyed." Tom spent that night copying all of his photographs and documents to multiple storage locations, including a safety deposit box he rented using cash. If something happened to him or to the submarine, he wanted the evidence to survive. Lieutenant Commander Webb had died before he could expose the truth about Project Seahawk. Tom was determined not to make the same mistake. The next morning, he returned to the submarine with renewed purpose. The encrypted radio logs represented his best chance of understanding the full scope of the operation that had cost Webb his life. And somewhere in that hidden compartment, locked inside those metal containers, lay the physical evidence that could prove everything. Tom began preparing to cut through the welded wall systematically. Whatever secrets the submarine held, he was going to uncover them. The government's attempts to buy his silence had only convinced him that the truth was worth the risk. Tom's breakthrough came on Wednesday morning when he discovered a water-damaged photograph wedged behind electrical conduits in the submarine's communication center. The image showed the grouper's crew posed on deck during what appeared to be a departure ceremony, but standing among the uniformed sailors was a civilian who'd been carefully omitted from all official records. The civilian was a slight man in his 50s, with intelligent eyes and expensive clothes that seemed out of place in the naval setting. He stood next to Lieutenant Commander Webb, their body language suggesting a relationship that extended beyond simple professional courtesy. More intriguingly, someone had tried to scratch out the civilian's face, though enough remained visible to show that he'd been deliberately targeted for removal from the historical record. Tom photographed the damaged image from multiple angles, using different lighting to bring out details that might help identify the mysterious civilian. The man's clothing and posture suggested wealth and authority, someone accustomed to being deferred to even in military settings. His presence among the crew, during what appeared to be a classified departure, suggested he was integral to Project Seahawk's operations. The photograph's discovery coincided with Tom's first successful breach of the welded wall. Using a combination of cutting torchwork and careful prying, he'd managed to create an opening large enough to squeeze through into the hidden compartment. What he found there transformed his understanding of the submarine's true purpose. The hidden workshop was larger than his glimpses through the ventilation holes had suggested, extending into areas that should have housed torpedo storage, according to the original blueprints. Someone had extensively modified the submarine's interior, creating a sophisticated base of operations that included communication equipment, document storage, and most importantly, a secure vault area where the locked metal containers were stored. Tom began his exploration methodically, photographing everything before disturbing anything. The workshop area contained evidence of recent activity that contradicted the submarine's abandoned status. Fresh coffee grounds in a percolator, newspapers dated within the past 5 years, and maintenance logs showing regular equipment checks as recently as 6 months ago. The implications were staggering. Someone had been using the submarine as an active base of operations long after its official decommissioning, maintaining the facade of abandonment while conducting activities that required sophisticated equipment and regular access to shore-based resources. The document files yielded the most revealing evidence. Tom found detailed records of cargo transfers dating from the 1970s through the early 2000s, showing a pattern of operations that had evolved from Cold War intelligence gathering to something that appeared more commercial in nature. The manifest entries described artifacts, precious metals, and what were euphemistically labeled as cultural materials being moved through the submarine on regular schedules. More disturbing were the financial records showing payments to numbered accounts in offshore banks. The amounts were substantial individual transfers in the millions of dollars, suggesting that Project Seahawk had become a highly profitable enterprise for its operators. The records indicated that Lieutenant Commander Webb had been documenting these financial irregularities before his death, building evidence of what appeared to be a systematic looting operation disguised as intelligence work. Tom's absorption in the documents was interrupted by his phone, buzzing with a call from Sarah. He'd been so focused on his discoveries that he'd forgotten to check in with his daughter, and her concern was evident in her voice. "Dad, where are you? I've been trying to reach you all morning." Tom realized he'd been inside the submarine for over 6 hours, so absorbed in the hidden compartment that he'd lost track of time. "I'm sorry, sweetheart. I've been working on the restoration and lost track of time. Mom's worried about you. She says you haven't been returning her calls either." The mention of Linda's concern surprised Tom. They'd barely spoken since the divorce proceedings, and he hadn't expected her to be monitoring his activities. "I didn't realize she'd been trying to reach me." "She has, and frankly, Dad, I'm starting to worry too. This whole submarine project seems to be consuming your life. When's the last time you left the harbor?" Tom couldn't remember. His world had narrowed to the submarine and its secrets, everything else fading into background noise. The realization was sobering. He was behaving like a man obsessed, exactly the kind of behavior that had contributed to his marriage's failure. "You're right. I've been letting the project take over. How about dinner tomorrow? We could catch up properly." Sarah's relief was audible. "I'd like that. And Dad, maybe you could show me what you're working on. I am an engineer, after all. I might be able to help." After ending the call, Tom climbed back to the deck and stood in the afternoon sunlight, trying to regain perspective on his situation. His discoveries were extraordinary, potentially explosive, but they were also consuming his life in ways that seemed unhealthy. The submarine's secrets were important, but not at the cost of his relationships with the people who mattered most. That evening, Tom met with Dr. Vasquez again, this time bringing copies of the most significant documents he'd discovered. Her reaction to the evidence was immediate and intense. "Tom, this is incredible. You've uncovered evidence of what appears to be one of the largest artifact smuggling operations in modern history. These financial records alone would be enough to launch federal investigations." "And possibly get me killed," Tom added, thinking about the government agent's warnings and Lieutenant Commander Webb's mysterious death. Dr. Vasquez studied the photograph of the unknown civilian. This man might be the key to understanding the entire operation. someone with the resources and connections to maintain a submarine as a private base of operations for 30 years. If we can identify him, we might be able to understand who's behind the cover-up attempts. Tom had been thinking the same thing. The civilian's presence in the photograph suggested he was a principal rather than a subordinate in Project Seahawk. His expensive clothes and confident posture indicated someone with significant wealth and authority. "I've been thinking about Agent Webb," Tom said. "His resemblance to Lieutenant Commander Webb can't be coincidental. If he's the son, then his interest in keeping this buried might be personal rather than official. That would explain the pressure you've been receiving. If his father was involved in something illegal, Agent Webb might be trying to protect his family's reputation rather than national security." The conversation gave Tom a new perspective on his situation. He wasn't just dealing with government secrecy or historical mysteries. He was potentially threatening someone's personal legacy and family honor. That made Agent Webb both more predictable and more dangerous. Tom returned to the submarine that night with mixed emotions. His discoveries represented the kind of historical significance that could make his restoration project nationally important. The evidence he'd uncovered could expose corruption that had lasted for decades and bring justice for crimes that had been covered up since the Cold War. But the personal cost was becoming clear. His obsession with the submarine's secrets was isolating him from Sarah and threatening the fragile rebuilding of their relationship. The government pressure was likely to intensify as his investigations continued, and somewhere in the shadows, people with significant resources and deadly intent were watching his every move. Tom secured the hidden compartment and prepared to leave the submarine. Tomorrow, he would have dinner with Sarah and try to explain why her father had purchased a vessel that seemed determined to destroy his life. The photograph of the mysterious civilian would have to wait for proper identification. First, Tom needed to reconnect with the people who could help him survive whatever was coming next. Sarah arrived at the harbor restaurant 20 minutes early, a habit she'd inherited from her mother's side of the family. Tom found her at a corner table overlooking the marina, her engineering notebook open beside a tablet, displaying what appeared to be technical drawings. Even during their personal dinner, she was working on solutions to complex problems. "Sorry I'm late," Tom said, sliding into the chair across from her. The past few days of discoveries had aged him, adding new lines around his eyes and a tension in his shoulders that spoke of sleepless nights. "You're not late, I'm early. Professional hazard." Sarah closed the notebook and studied her father's face with the careful attention she usually reserved for structural assessments. "Dad, you look exhausted. When's the last time you got a full night's sleep?" Tom couldn't remember. The submarine's secrets had invaded his dreams, filling his nights with images of shadowy government agents and mysterious cargo transfers. "The restoration work is more complex than I initially realized. There are aspects of the vessel that don't match the official documentation." "What kind of aspects?" Tom had rehearsed this conversation, knowing that Sarah would ask pointed questions and expect detailed answers. Her engineering background meant she would understand technical complexities that he couldn't explain to Pete or even Dr. Vasquez. Someone extensively modified the submarine's interior layout during its service life. Compartments that should exist according to the blueprints have been sealed off. Electrical systems have been upgraded far beyond what a decommissioned vessel would require. The evidence suggests the submarine remained active long after its official retirement from Navy service. Sarah leaned forward, her interest clearly piqued. "Active how? As some kind of private research vessel?" "That's what I'm trying to determine. The modifications are sophisticated and expensive, suggesting someone with significant resources was using the submarine for specialized purposes." Tom showed her photographs of the hidden compartment, carefully edited to remove the most sensitive documents and evidence. Sarah studied the images with the systematic approach she brought to all technical problems, asking questions about structural modifications, electrical systems, and the mechanics of the welding work. This level of modification would require dry dock facilities and specialized equipment, she concluded. Whoever did this work had access to naval shipyard resources. It's not something that could be done in secret without institutional support. Her analysis confirmed Tom's suspicions about the scope of the operation behind Project Seahawk. The submarine's conversion from military vessel to private base of operations had required resources that only government agencies or major corporations could provide. "There's something else," Tom said, producing the partially burned ledger he'd discovered that morning. The document contained detailed records of artifact locations and recovery operations spanning 3 decades. "I found evidence suggesting the submarine was being used for treasure hunting operations, possibly involving stolen art and artifacts." Sarah examined the ledger carefully, her expression growing more concerned as she read the entries. The financial figures were staggering: individual recovery operations, valued in the tens of millions of dollars, with regular payments to numbered accounts in offshore banking centers. "Dad, this looks like evidence of major criminal activity. If these records are accurate, someone was using a government submarine to conduct private treasure hunting operations worth hundreds of millions of dollars. And they killed Lieutenant Commander Webb when he tried to expose the operation." Tom finished. "I found his journals, documenting increasing concerns about the legal and ethical implications of what he was being asked to do." Sarah set down the ledger and studied her father's face with new understanding. "That's why the government agents have been pressuring you to sell the submarine back to them. They're not protecting national security, they're covering up decades of criminal activity." It gets more complicated. Agent Marcus Webb, who's been leading the pressure campaign, appears to be Lieutenant Commander Webb's son. His interest in keeping this buried might be personal rather than official. The implications settled over their conversation like a dark cloud. Tom wasn't just dealing with historical mysteries or government bureaucracy. He was threatening to expose crimes that had been covered up for 30 years, involving people who had demonstrated their willingness to kill to protect their secrets. "Dad, you need to go to the FBI with this evidence. This is way beyond anything you should be handling alone." "I've considered that. But how do I know who to trust? If this operation involved government resources and official cover-ups, then the corruption might extend to current law enforcement agencies." Sarah was quiet for a long moment, processing the full scope of her father's predicament. When she spoke again, her voice carried a new determination that reminded Tom of his own stubborn streak. "Then we document everything systematically and create multiple backup copies of the evidence. We make it impossible for them to suppress the truth by destroying a single set of records." The word "we" hit Tom like a physical blow. "Sarah, absolutely not. I won't have you involved in something this dangerous. These people have already killed once to protect their secrets." "Too late, Dad. The moment you showed me this evidence, I became involved. And frankly, you need help. This is too big and too complex for one person to handle alone." Tom wanted to argue, but he recognized the futility of trying to dissuade his daughter once she'd made up her mind. Sarah had inherited Linda's fierce loyalty, along with his stubborn determination, a combination that made her formidable when she decided to take on a challenge. Over the next hour, they developed a systematic plan for documenting and preserving the submarine's secrets. Sarah's engineering background provided valuable insights into secure data storage and evidence preservation. She suggested creating a comprehensive digital archive with copies distributed to multiple locations, making it impossible for the evidence to disappear, even if something happened to Tom or the submarine. "We need to identify the civilian in the photograph," Sarah said, studying the water-damaged image Tom had discovered. "He's clearly central to the entire operation. If we can figure out who he is, we might be able to understand the full scope of what we're dealing with." Tom had been thinking the same thing. The mysterious civilian represented the human face of Project Seahawk, the person who had likely orchestrated decades of criminal activity using government resources. Dr. Vasquez might be able to help with the identification. She has access to maritime historical records and connections to researchers who specialize in Cold War operations. Their conversation was interrupted by Tom's phone, buzzing with an unknown number. He answered cautiously, half expecting another government agent or threatening voice. "Mr. Reyes, this is Marcus Webb. I think we need to have another conversation about your submarine restoration project." Tom met Sarah's eyes across the table, seeing his own concern reflected in her expression. "What kind of conversation, Agent Webb?" "The kind that might help both of us get what we want. I'll be at Pier 17 tomorrow morning at 9 o'clock. I suggest you be there as well." The line went dead, leaving Tom staring at his phone. Agent Webb's tone had been different this time, less official, more personal. The change suggested that Tom's investigation had reached a point where Webb felt compelled to reveal more of his true motivations. "What did he want?" Sarah asked. "A meeting, tomorrow morning at the submarine. I'm coming with you." Tom started to protest, but Sarah cut him off with a look that brooked no argument. "Dad, we're partners in this now. I'm not letting you face Agent Webb alone, especially not when we don't know his real agenda." As they left the restaurant, Tom felt a mixture of gratitude and terror about his daughter's involvement. Having Sarah as an ally would strengthen his position significantly. Her engineering expertise and analytical mind were exactly what he needed to understand the submarine's complex secrets. But involving her also raised the stakes to an unbearable level. Tom could accept the risk to his own life in pursuit of the truth, but the thought of Sarah being hurt because of his discoveries was almost paralyzing. The next morning would bring answers to some of their questions about Agent Webb and Project Seahawk. But Tom suspected that those answers would only lead to more dangerous questions about the people who had built their fortunes on the submarine's dark secrets. The partially burned ledger tucked in Tom's jacket pocket represented decades of criminal activity that powerful people had killed to protect. Tomorrow, he would learn whether Agent Webb was trying to help expose the truth or simply find a more effective way to bury it forever. Agent Marcus Webb was already waiting on the submarine's deck when Tom and Sarah arrived at Pier 17. He stood with his back to the harbor, studying the vessel's conning tower with an expression that seemed more personal than professional. In the morning light, his resemblance to the officer in Lieutenant Commander Webb's photographs was even more striking. "Mr. Reyes, and you must be his daughter Sarah, isn't it?" Webb's tone was different from their previous encounters, less formal and more human. "Thank you both for coming." Sarah stepped forward, extending her hand with the confidence she brought to all professional encounters. "Agent Webb, my father tells me you have concerns about his restoration project." Webb smiled, but there was sadness in the expression that transformed his entire demeanor. "Among other things. But first, I owe you both an apology and an explanation." Tom felt his assumptions about the agent beginning to shift. Webb's body language suggested vulnerability rather than threat, and his eyes carried the weight of someone who'd been carrying difficult secrets for too long. "My name is Marcus Webb, but I'm not exactly the federal agent I've been pretending to be. I work for the government, but in a consulting capacity, investigating irregularities in military surplus programs. My real interest in this submarine is personal." Webb reached into his jacket and produced a leather portfolio containing documents that looked official but bore none of the standard government seals Tom had expected. The letterhead identified Webb as an independent contractor specializing in historical military asset recovery. "Lieutenant Commander James Webb was my father. He died in 1976, allegedly in a training accident at sea. I've spent the last 20 years trying to understand what really happened to him and why his death was covered up by people who should have been investigating it." The revelation recontextualized everything Tom had discovered about Project Seahawk. Agent Webb wasn't trying to suppress the truth, he was seeking it, just as desperately as Tom was. Sarah studied the credentials Webb had provided, her engineering mind evaluating the documentation with systematic attention. These papers suggest you've been investigating military surplus irregularities for years. Have you found evidence of systematic fraud? More than evidence, I found proof of a criminal conspiracy that's been operating for over 30 years, using decommissioned military assets to conduct private treasure hunting operations worth hundreds of millions of dollars. Webb led them below decks to the submarine's main compartment, producing his own set of keys that opened areas Tom hadn't yet accessed. The agent's familiarity with the vessel's layout suggested he'd been conducting his own investigation long before Tom purchased the submarine at auction. My father discovered that Project Seahawk was being used as cover for systematic looting of archaeological sites and wartime treasure caches throughout the Pacific. The submarine would transport recovered materials to numbered accounts in offshore banking centers, with profits shared among a small group of military officers and civilian contractors. Tom felt pieces of the puzzle clicking into place. The civilian in the photograph, he was the operation's civilian leader. Dr. Edward Crane, a private archaeologist who convinced the Navy that his treasure hunting operations served intelligence-gathering purposes during the Cold War. After the war ended, the operation continued as a purely criminal enterprise, with my father serving as the submarine commander until his conscience got the better of him. Webb produced additional photographs showing Dr. Crane in various locations around the Pacific, always in the company of military personnel and expensive equipment. The images painted a picture of a sophisticated operation that had used government resources to conduct private treasure hunting on an industrial scale. My father began documenting the illegal activities in 1975, building evidence for what he planned to be a comprehensive exposure of the entire operation. He was killed before he could present his evidence to congressional investigators. Sarah examined the photographs with growing fascination. How did they maintain operational secrecy for so long? This level of activity would require extensive shore-based support and multiple layers of official authorization. Compartmentalization and corruption. Different agencies handled different aspects of the operation, with no single office maintaining oversight of the complete picture. Key officials were either paid for their silence or convinced that the operation served legitimate intelligence purposes. Webb led them to the hidden compartment Tom had discovered, producing cutting equipment identical to what Tom had been using. The agent's approach to the welded wall was systematic and professional, suggesting he'd been planning this access for some time. "I've been waiting for someone to purchase this submarine so I could gain legitimate access to the sealed compartments. The government has been trying to reclaim her for years, but they needed a civilian owner to provide legal cover for suppressing any discoveries." The agent's cutting work revealed the full extent of the hidden compartment, including areas that Tom hadn't yet explored. The space was larger and more sophisticated than either of them had realized, containing not just workshop areas and document storage, but also a secure vault system that had remained sealed since the 1970s. "The main treasure cache is behind those vault doors," Webb explained, indicating massive steel barriers that required combination locks and electronic access systems. My father's final journal entries describe the contents as including Nazi gold, stolen art, and archaeological artifacts worth over $200 million. Tom stared at the vault doors, finally understanding the full scope of what he'd stumbled into. "And Dr. Crane has been trying to recover this treasure for 30 years. Dr. Crane died in 1998, but his organization survived. They've been systematically tracking down Project Seahawk assets, trying to recover the treasures before they can be exposed to public scrutiny or legal investigation." Webb produced his father's final journal, a leather-bound volume that contained detailed records of the treasure cache's contents and location. The entries described a collection of historical artifacts that would have enormous archaeological and financial value if properly authenticated and displayed. My father's final entry describes his plan to expose the entire operation and donate the recovered treasures to legitimate museums. He believed that the artifacts belonged in public collections rather than private hands. Sarah studied the journal entries with growing excitement. This represents one of the most significant archaeological discoveries of the modern era. The historical value alone would be incalculable. But Webb's expression remained somber. It also represents evidence of decades of criminal activity involving people who are still alive and still powerful. Exposing the truth about Project Seahawk won't just reveal historical treasures, it will destroy careers, expose corruption, and potentially send people to prison. Tom felt the weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders. His desperate gamble on a surplus submarine had evolved into something far more complex than simple restoration. He was now the guardian of evidence that could rewrite Cold War history and expose one of the largest criminal conspiracies of the modern era. "What do you need from us?" Tom asked. "Help accessing the vault and documenting its contents. My father's journal contains the access codes, but I need witnesses and photographic evidence that can't be suppressed or discredited." Webb handed Tom a set of combination numbers written in his father's careful handwriting. "Once we open that vault, there's no going back. Dr. Crane's successors will know that their secrets have been exposed, and they'll do whatever it takes to prevent the truth from becoming public." Tom looked at Sarah, seeing his own determination reflected in her eyes. They'd come too far to turn back now, and the truth about Lieutenant Commander Webb's death deserved to be told regardless of the personal cost. "Let's open it," Sarah said, her voice carrying the quiet confidence she brought to all engineering challenges. As Webb began entering the combination sequence, Tom realized that everything in his life had led to this moment. His mechanical skills, his stubborn refusal to accept defeat, even his desperate purchase of a surplus submarine, all of it had prepared him to be the person who would finally expose the truth about Project Seahawk. The vault door's massive locks began cycling through their sequences, each click bringing them closer to revelations that would change everything. Behind those steel barriers lay the physical evidence of crimes that had been hidden for 30 years. Marcus Webb's true credentials, the documents that revealed his real identity as the son of a murdered whistleblower, had transformed Tom's understanding of the entire situation. The agent wasn't his enemy. He was his ally in seeking justice for a man who had died trying to do the right thing. The vault door swung open with a deep, metallic groan, revealing the secrets that people had killed to protect. The vault's interior defied every expectation Tom had formed during weeks of speculation. Instead of the cramped storage space he'd imagined, the compartment opened into a sophisticated climate-controlled chamber that extended deep into areas that should have housed the submarine's ballast tanks. The engineering required to create this space while maintaining the vessel's seaworthiness was extraordinary. Metal shelving lined the walls, each shelf holding carefully catalogued containers that bore identification numbers, matching entries in Lieutenant Commander Webb's journals. But it was the captain's final orders, sealed in a waterproof container at the center of the vault, that revealed the true scope of what they were dealing with. Marcus Webb broke the seal with reverent care, his hands trembling slightly as he unfolded documents that had remained hidden since his father's death. The papers were written in the clear, methodical handwriting of a naval officer, but their content described activities that were anything but military. Emergency Protocol 7. Webb read aloud. "In the event of my death or disappearance, these materials are to be delivered to Senator Harold Morrison, chairman of the Senate Armed Services Committee, along with complete documentation of Project Seahawk's illegal activities." Tom felt a chill as he recognized the implications. Lieutenant Commander Webb hadn't just been documenting criminal activities, he'd been preparing to expose them at the highest levels of government. His murder had prevented a scandal that would have reached into the halls of Congress. Sarah was photographing everything with systematic precision, her engineering background evident in the way she documented not just the contents, but also the vault's construction and the sophisticated preservation systems that had kept everything intact for decades. Dad, look at this. The preservation equipment is still running. Someone's been maintaining this vault's environmental systems. Webb examined the climate control systems with growing concern. The power consumption alone would be enormous. Whoever's been maintaining this has access to the submarine and detailed knowledge of its systems. The realization sent cold fear through Tom's chest. They weren't the first people to access the vault. Someone else had been here, recently and regularly. The submarine's secrets weren't as buried as they'd believed. The captain's orders contained detailed instructions for exposing Project Seahawk, including lists of congressional contacts, media representatives, and legal experts who could help ensure the truth reached the public. But more importantly, they contained specific warnings about individuals who were actively involved in the cover-up. Dr. Edward Crane was just the public face of the operation. Webb read from his father's final instructions. The real power behind Project Seahawk belongs to a consortium of military contractors and former intelligence officers who've been using government assets for private gain since the end of World War II. The documents identified specific individuals by name, including several who were still alive and holding positions of authority in government and private industry. Tom recognized some of the names from recent news coverage: defense contractors, former Pentagon officials, and at least one current member of Congress. "This goes deeper than we imagined," Tom said, studying photographs of Project Seahawk's leadership structure. "We're not just exposing Cold War-era crimes, we're threatening people who are still active in current government operations." Webb's expression was grim as he continued reading his father's final orders. "My father knew he was in danger when he wrote these instructions. He specifically warns that Project Seahawk's operators would kill to protect their secrets, and that any investigation would face official resistance at the highest levels." Sarah had moved to the vault's storage areas, documenting the containers that held the physical evidence of decades of treasure hunting operations. What she found there left her speechless. "Dad, Marcus, you need to see this. These aren't just random artifacts. This is a systematic collection of some of the most important historical treasures missing from World War II. The containers held items that Tom recognized from museum displays and historical documentaries: golden artifacts from Nazi hordes, ancient Asian art that had been looted during wartime, and archaeological treasures that museums had been searching for since the war's end. The collection's value was incalculable, both financially and historically. But more disturbing were the recent additions to the collection: items that bore inventory tags, indicating they'd been acquired within the past 5 years. Project Seahawk hadn't ended with Lieutenant Commander Webb's death. It had evolved and continued operating under new leadership. "Someone's been using this submarine as an active base of operations," Webb concluded, examining the recent inventory additions. "The treasure hunting operation never stopped. It just became more sophisticated and better hidden." Tom's phone buzzed with an incoming call from Pete, the harbor master. He answered cautiously, wondering if their activities had been noticed by harbor security. "Tom, you need to know that there are some official-looking vehicles in the parking area and men in suits asking questions about your submarine. They don't look like the usual government types." Through the submarine's hull, Tom could hear the sound of multiple vehicles arriving at the pier. Heavy doors slamming, voices conferring in the urgent tones of people conducting coordinated operations. "We need to get out of here," Webb said, his tone carrying the authority of someone with experience in dangerous situations. "But first, we need to secure this evidence. If they reclaim the submarine, everything we've discovered will disappear forever." Sarah was already working on the problem, using her engineering expertise to devise a solution. The ventilation system connects to the harbor's storm drain network. If we can document everything quickly and create backup copies, we might be able to get the evidence out, even if they trap us here. Webb produced a portable document scanner from his equipment bag, moving with the efficiency of someone who'd planned for this contingency. "My father's orders include specific instructions for preserving evidence under emergency conditions. We need to follow his protocol exactly. The sound of footsteps on the submarine's deck above them added urgency to their work. Tom could hear voices issuing orders in the clipped tones of people conducting a coordinated search operation. Tom Reyes, this is Agent Collins with the Treasury Department. We have a federal warrant to search this vessel. Please exit the submarine immediately. Webb smiled grimly at the announcement. Collins isn't Treasury Department. He's private security, working for the people who've been maintaining this operation. The federal warrant is probably fabricated. Sarah finished copying the captain's final orders and the most critical evidence files. I've got everything essential backed up to multiple locations. Even if they confiscate our equipment, the evidence will survive. Webb was working on a different problem, preparing the submarine's defensive systems for what appeared to be an inevitable confrontation. Lieutenant Commander Webb's final orders had included detailed instructions for using the vessel's modified systems as protection against hostile boarding operations. My father anticipated that Project Seahawk's operators might try to reclaim the submarine by force. He modified several of the vessel's systems to serve as defensive measures. Tom watched Webb activate controls that weren't shown on any of the submarine's official blueprints. Emergency lighting systems came online, sealing certain compartments and creating secure areas that could be defended against intruders. The submarine was designed to be both a treasure vault and a fortress, Webb explained. If we can reach the control room, we can use her systems to protect ourselves while we figure out how to get the evidence to people who can act on it. The footsteps above them were becoming more organized, suggesting that the boarding party was conducting a systematic search of the submarine's upper areas. It was only a matter of time before they discovered the breach in the welded wall and followed it to the hidden vault. Tom felt his mechanical instincts taking over, analyzing the submarine's systems and identifying ways to use them for purposes their designers had never intended. The vessel's ballast controls, electrical systems, and communication equipment could all be repurposed as defensive measures if he understood their capabilities correctly. Sarah, can you help me understand the submarine's electrical distribution system? If we can control power to different sections, we might be able to create secure areas and communication channels. Sarah studied the electrical schematics Webb had brought from his father's records. It's more sophisticated than I initially realized. Someone spent considerable effort turning this submarine into a mobile command center with independent power systems and secure communication capabilities. The captain's final orders had become their operational manual for a confrontation that Lieutenant Commander Webb had foreseen decades earlier. His preparations for exposing Project Seahawk had included contingency plans for protecting the evidence against people who would kill to suppress it. Webb secured the vault's most critical evidence in a waterproof container designed for emergency transport. Once we leave this compartment, we're committed to seeing this through to the end. The people coming for us have too much at stake to let us walk away with this evidence. Tom looked at his daughter, seeing determination in her eyes that reminded him of her childhood fearlessness when facing new challenges. Sarah had inherited his stubborn streak and her mother's analytical intelligence, making her a formidable ally in the confrontation ahead. Are you ready for this, sweetheart? I've been ready since the moment you showed me that first photograph. These people killed your friend's father and covered it up for 30 years. It's time for the truth to come out. The explosive welding torch that had become Tom's signature tool for accessing the submarine's secrets now sat ready to serve a very different purpose. If they were going to turn the submarine into a fortress, they would need to control access points and create defensive positions using whatever tools were available. The sound of cutting equipment from above indicated that their visitors had found the breach in the welded wall. The final confrontation over Project Seahawk's secrets was about to begin, with Lieutenant Commander Webb's final orders serving as their guide for exposing 30 years of murder and conspiracy. Tom secured the torch and prepared to follow his daughter and Marcus Webb into a battle that would determine whether justice could finally be served for crimes that powerful people had thought were buried forever. The submarine's emergency lighting cast red shadows through the compartments as Tom led Sarah and Webb toward the control room. Behind them, the sound of cutting equipment grew louder as their pursuers worked to breach the welded wall. Webb's knowledge of his father's defensive modifications was proving invaluable. The submarine had been designed to protect its secrets against exactly this kind of forced entry. Tom's explosive welding torch had become their key to controlling access points throughout the vessel. The tool that had unlocked the submarine's mysteries was now being used to seal critical passages, creating choke points where they could control the flow of the boarding party. The control room has independent power and communication systems, Webb explained as they moved through the submarine's cramped passages. My father's modifications included satellite uplinks that can't be jammed by standard equipment. Sarah was documenting their route and the submarine's defensive capabilities with the systematic approach she brought to all technical challenges. If we can establish communication with outside authorities, we might be able to get help before they overwhelm our positions. The submarine's ballast control systems had been modified to serve purposes beyond simple diving operations. Webb activated controls that sealed certain compartments and flooded others, creating barriers that would slow any pursuit. The vessel was becoming a maze of accessible and inaccessible areas, with Tom's team controlling the navigation. Collins and his people are professionals, but they don't know the submarine's layout as well as we do, Webb said, monitoring their progress through security cameras that provided views of the boarding party's activities. They're moving cautiously because they don't want to damage the treasure vault. Tom could see the boarding party through the camera feeds, 6 men in tactical gear moving through the submarine with the practiced efficiency of people accustomed to hostile environments. They weren't government agents, despite their official credentials. Their equipment and methods suggested private military contractors. They're not here to arrest us, Tom realized. They're here to eliminate witnesses and reclaim the evidence. Sarah had established communication with the outside world, using the submarine's modified radio systems. Her engineering background was proving crucial in understanding the sophisticated equipment Webb's father had installed decades earlier. I've contacted Dr. Vasquez and given her our location and situation, Sarah reported. She's alerting media contacts and law enforcement agencies that can't be compromised by Project Seahawk's influence. The submarine's defensive systems included measures that went beyond simple access control. Webb activated flooding systems that created water barriers in key passages, making it difficult for the boarding party to advance quickly. The vessel was designed to buy time for evidence to be transmitted and preserved. Tom's mechanical expertise was being tested in ways he'd never imagined. The submarine systems required constant adjustment and monitoring to maintain their defensive configuration. His lifetime of solving mechanical problems was being applied to a life-or-death situation involving equipment he was learning to understand on the fly. They've breached the first compartment, Webb reported, watching the security feeds. But they're having trouble with the flooded passages. The submarine is working exactly as my father designed it to. The welding torch that had opened the submarine's secrets was proving equally effective at sealing passages against pursuit. Tom moved through the vessel with practiced efficiency, using his mechanical skills to create barriers and modify systems for defensive purposes. The treasure vault is secure, Sarah confirmed, monitoring the chamber's status from the control room. Even if they reach it, the evidence has been copied and transmitted to multiple locations. Webb was coordinating their defensive efforts while simultaneously trying to establish contact with legitimate law enforcement agencies. His father's final orders had included lists of trustworthy officials who could act on evidence of Project Seahawk's criminal activities. Senator Morrison's office has confirmed receipt of our transmission, Webb announced. The evidence is now in the hands of people who can launch official investigations. But their immediate situation remained dangerous. Collins and his team were systematic professionals who wouldn't be deterred by flooded passages and sealed compartments. They had the resources and motivation to overcome any defensive measures the submarine could provide. Tom realized that their best chance of survival lay not in passive defense, but in turning the submarine's systems into active countermeasures. The vessel's electrical distribution, ballast controls, and communication equipment could be used to create confusion and delay among the boarding party. "Sarah, can you help me overload the electrical systems in sections they're trying to access? If we can control power distribution, we might be able to slow their advance." Sarah studied the submarine's electrical schematics with the analytical approach she brought to all engineering challenges. "I can create power surges and blackouts in specific areas. It won't stop them, but it will make their job much more difficult." The explosive welding torch sat ready for whatever emergency might require its unique capabilities. Tom had learned to think of the tool not just as a means of cutting metal, but as a versatile instrument for solving problems that required both precision and power. Webb's knowledge of his father's defensive preparations was proving crucial to their survival. Lieutenant Commander Webb had anticipated this confrontation and prepared the submarine to protect both evidence and witnesses against people who would kill to preserve their secrets. The first phase of their defense had succeeded in slowing the boarding party and ensuring the evidence reached outside authorities. But the real test was yet to come when Collins and his team reached the control room and the final confrontation began. The control room's steel door buckled under the impact of cutting equipment as Collins and his team finally breached the submarine's inner defenses. Tom had used every defensive measure at his disposal, but professional mercenaries with unlimited resources were ultimately unstoppable in a confined space. "Mr. Reyes, we need to talk." Collins's voice carried through the submarine's intercom system, his tone suggesting negotiation rather than immediate violence. "You've created quite a complicated situation for everyone involved." Webb positioned himself at the communication controls, maintaining contact with the outside authorities who were now aware of their situation. The evidence had been transmitted successfully, but their personal survival depended on reaching some kind of accommodation with people who had killed to protect their secrets. Sarah worked frantically to activate the final defensive measures described in Lieutenant Commander Webb's orders. The submarine's ballast systems could be used to create one last barrier between them and their pursuers. By partially flooding the control room area, they could make any assault extremely difficult. "The Nazi gold cache you've discovered represents recovered assets that were legitimately seized during wartime operations," Collins continued, his voice echoing through the submarine's passages. "Your interference with government property has created national security complications that extend beyond simple treasure hunting." Tom recognized the argument as sophisticated misdirection. Collins was trying to reframe Project Seahawk's criminal activities as legitimate government operations, but the evidence they discovered proved that the treasure hunting had continued decades after the war's end. "Tell him about the inventory additions from the past 5 years," Tom called back. "Tell him about the offshore banking accounts and the systematic looting of archaeological sites throughout the Pacific." The submarine's main treasure vault was now secure behind multiple barriers that would take hours to breach. But more importantly, the Nazi gold cache, the crown jewel of Project Seahawk's criminal enterprise, had been fully documented and transmitted to authorities who could ensure its proper disposition. Webb's father had hidden the gold not to enrich himself, but to preserve it as evidence of the systematic corruption that had cost him his life. The gleaming bars and coins represented not just monetary value, but proof of how government resources had been perverted for private gain. "My father died trying to return these treasures to their rightful owners," Webb announced through the intercom. "Museums and governments throughout the Pacific have been searching for these artifacts since World War II ended. Collins and his team had finally breached the control room's outer defenses, but they found themselves facing the submarine's most sophisticated defensive measure, a partial flooding system that turned the final approach into a dangerous underwater passage. Tom's explosive welding torch served its final purpose as he used it to seal the flooding system's controls, ensuring that Collins couldn't simply reverse the defensive measures. The tool that had unlocked the submarine's secrets would prevent those secrets from being suppressed again. "You're fighting for people who've been dead for 30 years. Collins called out, his voice distorted by the water barriers between them. The current operators of this recovery program serve legitimate intelligence-gathering purposes. Sarah had established multiple communication channels with outside authorities, ensuring that their situation was being monitored by agencies that couldn't be compromised by Project Seahawk's influence. FBI and Treasury agents are en route to our location. Congressional investigators have been briefed on our discoveries." The confrontation had evolved from a simple boarding action to a complex standoff involving federal agencies, congressional oversight, and international law enforcement. Collins and his team were no longer operating in the shadows. Their actions were being observed and documented by legitimate authorities. Webb realized that their defensive strategy had succeeded beyond his father's most optimistic expectations. The evidence is now part of official congressional investigations and international law enforcement operations. Even if something happens to us, the truth about Project Seahawk will be exposed. Tom felt a profound sense of completion as he watched Collins and his team retreat from the flooded control room. His desperate gamble on a surplus submarine had evolved into something far more significant than personal redemption. It had become an instrument of justice for crimes that had been hidden for decades. The Nazi gold cash would be returned to its rightful owners. The archaeological treasures would find their way to legitimate museums. The evidence of corruption and murder would be presented to congressional investigators who could ensure that justice was finally served. Sarah's engineering expertise had proven crucial to their survival, but more importantly, her involvement had given Tom a partner who understood both the technical complexities and the moral imperatives of their situation. Together, they had transformed a desperate man's last gamble into a victory for truth and accountability. Webb carried his father's legacy forward, not as a burden of inherited shame, but as a mission accomplished after 30 years of patient investigation. Lieutenant Commander James Webb's final orders had been executed successfully, ensuring that his sacrifice would finally serve the cause of justice. The explosive welding torch lay silent now, its work complete. The tool that had opened the submarine's secrets and defended those secrets against suppression would become a symbol of how ordinary people could challenge institutional corruption when they possessed the courage to seek truth, regardless of personal cost. Collins and his team withdrew from the submarine as federal authorities arrived at the harbor. The final confrontation over Project Seahawk's secrets had ended not in violence, but in the exposure of truth that would transform how Cold War history was understood and remembered. 6 months after the confrontation aboard the submarine, Tom stood in the office of Reyes Marine Salvage, watching Sarah update the company's project tracking software. The space overlooked San Pedro Harbor from Pier 17, where the restored submarine now served as both their headquarters and a floating monument to the power of truth over institutional corruption. The new business license hanging on the wall represented more than Tom's transition from desperate mechanic to respected marine salvage operator. It symbolized his transformation from isolated failure to community leader. The Project Seahawk revelations had made him a reluctant celebrity, but more importantly, they had given him a purpose that extended far beyond personal survival. The Maritime Historical Society wants to schedule another documentary crew next week, Sarah announced, scrolling through emails that had become a daily routine. This one's from the BBC. They're doing a series on Cold War conspiracies that were finally exposed. Tom nodded absently, his attention focused on the harbor, where Marcus Webb was conducting another training session with new Coast Guard recruits. Webb had left his consulting work to become the director of a new federal task force investigating military surplus fraud, using his expertise to prevent future Project Seahawk-style operations. The congressional hearings that followed their discoveries had lasted 3 months, exposing a web of corruption that reached into multiple government agencies and private corporations. Tom's testimony had been crucial in establishing the timeline of criminal activities, while Sarah's technical analysis had helped investigators understand how the submarine's modifications had enabled decades of illegal operations. Dr. Vasquez entered the office carrying coffee and the latest updates from the archaeological teams working to catalogue and return the recovered treasures. Her research had proven invaluable in identifying the legitimate owners of artifacts that had been missing since World War II. The Japanese government has confirmed receipt of the Meiji period ceramics, she reported, settling into the chair that had become her regular spot during these weekly briefings. They're planning a special exhibition dedicated to items recovered from Project Seahawk's operations. The return of stolen treasures to their rightful owners had become a complex international effort involving museums, governments, and private collectors throughout the Pacific. The Nazi gold had been distributed to Holocaust survivor organizations and museums dedicated to preserving wartime history. Each return represented a small victory for justice over institutional greed. Tom's relationship with his family had been transformed by the events surrounding Project Seahawk. Linda had initially been skeptical of his claims about the submarine's importance, but the national media attention and congressional recognition had convinced her that her ex-husband had finally found his proper calling. "Mom wants to know if you're coming to dinner Sunday," Sarah said, looking up from her computer. "She's been following the news coverage, and I think she's proud of what we accomplished." The invitation represented a healing that Tom had thought impossible 6 months earlier. Linda's pride in his achievements had begun rebuilding the mutual respect that their marriage had lost during his years of professional struggles. They weren't reconciling romantically, but they were rediscovering the friendship that had originally brought them together. Pete knocked on the office doorframe, his harbor master uniform bearing new commendations that reflected his role in supporting the Project Seahawk investigation. "Tom, there's someone here to see you. Says she's from the State Department." The visitor was a woman in her 40s, with the confident demeanor of someone accustomed to handling sensitive international negotiations. She introduced herself as Deputy Assistant Secretary Patricia Reyes, responsible for coordinating the return of recovered artifacts to their countries of origin. "Mr. Reyes, I wanted to personally thank you for your cooperation throughout this investigation. The State Department has recovered cultural treasures worth over $200 million because of your willingness to expose Project Seahawk's activities." Tom accepted her gratitude with the quiet satisfaction of someone who had finally found work that mattered beyond personal profit. The submarine restoration had evolved from desperate gamble to legitimate business, but more importantly, it had become a platform for preventing similar crimes in the future. The office walls displayed photographs from the recovery operations, showing artifacts being returned to museums in Japan, the Philippines, Korea, and other Pacific nations. Each photograph represented families reunited with ancestral treasures, museums able to complete historical collections, and nations reclaiming cultural heritage that had been stolen during wartime. Sarah had become his full partner in the salvage business, applying her engineering expertise to maritime recovery operations while maintaining the documentation standards that had made their evidence against Project Seahawk unassailable. Her analytical approach complemented Tom's mechanical intuition, creating a formidable team for complex salvage challenges. "We've got 3 new contracts pending approval," Sarah announced, reviewing the company's project pipeline. 2 involve military surplus vessels that might contain undiscovered artifacts, and 1 is a private yacht recovery that could lead to insurance fraud investigations. Tom smiled at the irony. His desperate purchase of a surplus submarine had prepared him for a career he'd never imagined, using mechanical expertise and investigative instincts to uncover truth in situations where others saw only problems. The skills he'd developed over 30 years as a mechanic had found their perfect application. Marcus Webb had become more than a business associate. He'd become the son Tom had never had, and the partner who understood both the technical challenges and moral imperatives of their work. Webb's dedication to his father's memory had evolved into a broader mission to prevent institutional corruption from hiding behind official secrecy. The submarine itself had been transformed from floating monument to active headquarters for their expanding operation. The treasure vault now served as a secure storage facility for evidence in ongoing investigations, while the restored living quarters provided office space and meeting areas for the growing network of researchers, investigators, and government officials working to prevent future Project Seahawk-style operations. As the afternoon sun cast long shadows across San Pedro Harbor, Tom reflected on the journey that had brought him from desperate isolation to purposeful community leadership. His father's toolbox sat in its place of honor on his desk, its worn tools a reminder that the most important victories often came from refusing to accept defeat when everyone else had given up hope. The new business license represented more than professional success. It symbolized the redemption that came from using personal skills to serve purposes larger than individual survival. Tom Reyes had found his calling not in spite of his struggles, but because of them.